Before starting tonight, I'd like to thank Mabel for inviting me to share some of my work with you this evening. I also want to thank Lancaster History for their generous support of my research with the research grant that they awarded me all the way back in 2019 before the pandemic started. I finally got to complete it last summer, so I was really glad to finally be able to come up to Lancaster and spend a week there. I also want to thank all of you for attending tonight. I very much look forward to our conversation after my talk in the Q&A. So my talk tonight, as Mabel explained, is drawn from my one of my current book projects called Clothing the Babel, The Material Culture of Ethnic Identity in Early America, which examines what I call the politics of dress, focusing mostly on people in Pennsylvania from about 1750 to 1820. My project's goal is to document how different white ethnic and/or religious groups dressed in what was one of the most ethnically, racially, religiously diverse regions of early America. My other goal is to measure how observers perceived these people's appearances and use them to measure different ethnic groups or religious groups' fitness to be loyal colonial subjects or engaged citizens of the new United States. That means that my project aims, first of all, to highlight the critical role of material goods, particularly clothing and other personal items, and the role that they played in processes of cultural assimilation and the creation of white racial identities in the early US. And my project also gives new insight into how personal appearance and group identities were being negotiated on a daily basis during the late colonial, revolutionary, and early Republican periods. So my research in many respects then foreshadows patterns of cultural stereotyping and racial and ethnic profiling that we see at work in the US today. And I think one of the messages of my work is that early Americans, much like us, often made lots of judgments about people based upon their appearances. That certainly included judging the color of their skin, but it also included judging the clothing that they were wearing, including what kinds of shoes they had on, what kind of hats they were wearing, the style of their hair, the jewelry that they wore, and the tools or implements that they carried. So let me advance gotta get my little slides going. There we go. So I want to give you some overview of where I'm going tonight. First, I'd like to talk about where I began my research, talking a little bit about travelers' accounts. Then I'd like to do a longer section on focusing in on the Quakers and talking specifically about hats. The third section that I'm going to deal with focuses in on Germans and talks about clothing on the body. The fourth section talks about the Scots-Irish and focuses in on the tools or implements that they carried. And then the last section is just a conclusion where I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think this is important. So that's kind of where I'm going. So, travelers' accounts. I began this project thinking a lot about travelers' accounts and the certainty with which travelers assumed they could identify the groups they were observing or interacting with. For example, when the Philadelphia physician Benjamin Rush traveled from his home in Philadelphia to Carlisle in 1784, he lodged at a Bucks County inn where he was, quote, attended by a neat, handsome Quaker girl. The next day, he retired to another inn where, quote, the tavern keeper was a lively, talking little Quaker. 3 decades later, in 1804, another traveler in Pennsylvania, this time a New Englander, James Ford, made similar ethnically tinged observations, only he focused mostly on Germans. 18 miles outside of Lancaster, he, quote, slept with and lodged with an old German and noted that, quote, people civil, mostly Germans. 3 years after that, in 1807, another traveler, this one an Englishman, Fortescue Cumming, described his central Pennsylvania innkeeper as, quote, an honest and obliging German. Outside Carlisle, he met, quote, a plain countryman from Downpatrick in the north of Ireland. And at Bedford, he encountered 5 more, quote, plain Irishmen who were, he said, quote, uninformed of anything beyond their own business, which was peddling. So such observations intrigued me. And I had read a lot of travel literature back when I was doing my dissertation and writing my first book on Carlisle. So most obviously, these travel accounts, these travelers were clear evidence, that ethnic, or what I'd more appropriately characterize as ethno-religious identities, mattered a lot in Pennsylvania, and that a lot of people at the time described Pennsylvania's landscape by looking through an ethnic lens. More important was that using labels like Quaker, Presbyterian, or Lutheran, or Irish or German to describe people had meaning, because these terms were clearly shorthand ways for travelers to categorize and ultimately rank the strangers they met or observed on their journeys. To be ethnic, I could clearly see, implied that one was both unfamiliar and often inferior to the person doing the observation. These terms thus signaled the ways that certain groups deviated from what we might call metropolitan or Anglo norms. But the question that I really sought to answer was, how did they know this? Or how did they think they knew whom they were observing? What clues or cues were they using to distinguish among different groups? And why did they seem so confident in their assessments? Now, to be sure, sound obviously offered some clues to these travelers. Hearing someone's surname spoken aloud, or listening for speech patterns, dialects, or the sound of non-English languages being spoken were clearly indications of group identities. I mean, Quakers spoke in a distinctively plain style. Irish immigrants had a marked brogue, and Germans spoke either heavily accented English or no English at all. So sound was clearly part of the way that they deciphered this human landscape. And smell was probably important as well. Higher class people were cleaner than lower class people. So certainly smell was a way to suss out one's class identity. But visual and material cultural clues were absolutely essential. And that's really where my research is focused. During an enlightened age when observation was being increasingly elevated to a science, at a time when sumptuary laws were no longer policing the boundaries between different classes, and at a time when so many immigrants were arriving in the colonies, and so many diverse kinds of immigrants were arriving in the colonies, people were accustomed to looking closely at people's bodies for clues about their identity. Dress and self-presentation really mattered. Just as important, religious and immigrant groups, I would argue, were making choices about how to dress and what old world styles to retain. So there's an observation going on, but there are also choices that individuals are making about how they're going to dress themselves. So my project then argues that ethnicity was an embodied experience in early America. It was one that Europeans and Americans believe was readable in their and others' dress and self-presentation. So what I'd like to do with the time remaining to me is talk more specifically about what I've found so far about how people knew what they knew and what exactly they were reading. So to start then, I'm beginning with a print probably most of you are familiar with. This is the 1764 print, "The German Bleeds and Bears Ye Furs." It's one of 10 prints that were published during the Paxton Crisis of 1763 and 64. And I'm assuming that most of you know what the Paxton Crisis was. This is 1763, the Paxton Boys rise up and murder groups of Conestoga Indians outside of Lancaster. Then they charge into Lancaster and they break down the workhouse door and murder a group of women, children, and older men. And this sets off a political crisis in the colony that results in a kind of pamphlet war as people in the colony, including Benjamin Franklin, debate the actions of these men. This is a print that's frequently used by scholars, and it appears in many early American historical works. But what's interesting is most scholars ultimately use the verses below it to interpret it. The verses say, and I know my picture's just a wee bit cloudy, hazy there. The German bleeds and bears ye furs of Quaker lords and savage curs. The Hibernian frets with new disaster and kicks to fling his broad-brimmed master. But help at hand resolves to hold down the Hibernian's head or all tumble down. The message is clear. Pennsylvania's new immigrant colonists, the Germans and Scots-Irish, had fallen victim to the self-interested machinations of the colony's Quaker masters and their savage partners, the colony's indigenous peoples. The cartoon thus offered a barbed commentary on Pennsylvania's intercultural politics during the 1760s and pointedly critiqued Franklin's attempts to work with the Quaker political faction in the colony to replace the colony's proprietary government with a royal one. But viewers in the 18th century would have looked at this cartoon differently. They would have focused on the images to interpret it. Much like political cartoonists today, the artist here presumed that Pennsylvanians did not need to be told who was or what was happening. So what did they see and how did they see it? So let me begin with sort of the easy people in the cartoon. First, there's Benjamin Franklin. The presence of his likeness on the sidelines offers powerful testament to his recognizability at mid-century. Pennsylvanians knew who he was, they knew how he looked, and they knew that he dressed like an English gentleman. So Franklin is a recognizable figure. And again, we're using material culture cues to notice this. More interesting, I'd argue, is the indigenous man, who is probably the most stereotyped individual in this scene. He's outfitted, as you'll see, with a tomahawk, an item that had certainly come to symbolize savagery by the 18th century. And he carries a pack bearing the initials of IP for the Quaker merchant Israel Pemberton, a man who many frontiersmen blame for supplying native peoples with weapons to attack them. He's also, I would argue, minimally clothed. He is what we would call nearly naked, which was clearly meant to be another mark of his savagery. His presentation is a far cry from the much more realistic one drawn by the York County artist Lewis Miller of the native peoples who visited York in 1808. And notice that these native peoples are certainly dressed differently from Europeans of the time, but they are dressed. They are not naked. Then we get to some of what I would argue are the more complex portrayals in this Paxton cartoon. First is, and one of the most striking, is the Quaker lord. One of the most striking features of this print is how the artist, like other artists of the time, used the distinctive broad-brimmed hat worn by Quaker men to both symbolize and satirize him. As many of you probably know, the Society of Friends, or Quakers as their detractors called them, took their hats very seriously. Beginning in the 17th century, not long after their founding, male Friends adopted the wearing of unadorned, wide-brimmed castor hats that were often white in color as expressions of their plainness and Christian simplicity. They continued to wear them into the 18th and 19th centuries, even though they were outmoded and considered outmoded and unfashionable by that time. Although these hats might seem innocuous enough today, they were actually, as some of you may know, highly politicized because of male friends' refusal to engage in what was called hat honor, which was the social convention of doffing one's hat to one's social superiors. This practice, or lack of practice, the lack of this customary practice, outraged many people in England and America for the challenge they felt it posed to class-based hereditary politics. Consequently, critics on both sides of the Atlantic often use these hats to represent the entire sect and its values, rendering Quaker men synonymous with their broad-brimmed hats. Yep. You can see how this played out in this 1809 British print called The Road to London, or The Countrymen and the Quakers, by the British cartoonist George Mutard Woodward. Woodward in this print, although this is an early 19th century print, Woodward builds on a long English tradition of lampooning Quaker godliness and seriousness by focusing on their recognizable forms of dress, including their plain style of clothing. And you'll notice that the solid colors, the sort of unadorned suits that they wear, and their broad-brimmed hats. And notice that the broad-brimmed hats are quite exaggerated in the cartoon. And he's also uses their bodies as a way to illustrate their asceticism by playing up their pinched faces, their rather lean physiques, and they're standing on tiptoes as if waiting expectantly for the inner light to strike them. And the tiptoes is kind of a theme that I see in a lot of British cartoons of Quakers in the early 19th century. And again, it seems to be something about their, again, waiting for revelation from God, waiting for that to feel that inner light. He uses the captions to drive his message home. When the rural English bumpkin, who's on the left of your screen, asks the Quakers which way to London, and obviously there's a sign right above him. So this is also a commentary on sort of the rural, uneducated Englishman. The two Quaker men reply with a kind of condescending seriousness, saying, and again, he's making fun of their speech patterns too here. They say, quote, "Verily, I do not understand thy meaning. Thou first tellest a lie, and then asketh us a question." So, by contrast, in Pennsylvania of the 1760s, mocking the broad brims took a more heated turn because Quakers held the reins of political power in the colony. I mean, in the 1760s, the Quakers really were and had been the colony's primary power brokers. Now, this is going to change, as some of you know colonial history know. It's going to change in the 1760s and certainly during the Revolution. But at this time, this is just at the point where their power is starting to be called into question. They are still very much the power brokers. So cartoons like this one, another one from the Paxton Crisis, are very much, they're doing something slightly different than that English cartoon of the 19th century. The English cartoons are poking fun at Quakers as sort of a group kind of trying to challenge their way into power. But in Pennsylvania, the Quakers are the power brokers, and a lot of cartoonists are essentially trying to challenge their power as colony leaders. To Quaker critics, and they included many of Pennsylvania's newly arrived Irish and English and German settlers who were very much jockeying for political power in the colony, mocking Quakers as broad brims was a way, I would argue, to actually try to undermine their authority. And these Pennsylvania critics were quite brutal. This cartoon, Franklin and the Quakers, again, another one from the Paxton Crisis, accuses the broad brims, all kind of gathered around a table there, of essentially engaging in a whole series of backroom deals. It also accuses them, Israel Pemberton, again, of distributing weapons to Native peoples. And over in the corner, in the right-hand corner, it accuses them of engaging in sexual liaisons with Native women. Pamphlet writers from the Paxton Crisis certainly reinforce these visual messages. One writer argued the Quakers were neither meek nor peaceable. Rather, quote, their love of worldly power had long suffered the province to bleed beneath the savage knife. In short, Quaker claims to simplicity, honesty, modesty, and even pacifism were a charade. Most of all, the broad-brimmed hat was a prop in a duplicitous performance that aimed to hold non-Quaker colonists hostage to Quaker economic interests and their overly friendly relationship with indigenous peoples like the Delawares. We see similar themes at work in this 1821 British cartoon, The Radical Quaker. Here, the artist drew the plain-dressed Quaker broad brim, wearing a white hat adorned with a red and white cockade to symbolize his radical intent. He then rides a bicycle that's powered by the spirit, adorned with a figurehead of William Penn. But in his enthusiasm, he self-righteously plows over the figures of oppression, Blarney, taxes, and military despotism, while the crowd behind him cheers, among other things, "Bravo, Broadbrim." Lest one think that the Broadbrim is the hero, however, one quickly notices the printed sheet he carries in his hand may decree the spirit of despotism in contemporary British politics, but it actually depicts him on his bicycle, thereby inviting readers to consider the Quaker as the true despot. So taken together then, these illustrations suggest that whether in Britain or America, Quaker men, as symbolized by their broad-brimmed hat and plain dress and speech, were not what they appeared to be. As such, that lively talking Quaker tavern keeper that Benjamin Rush met in 1784 was easily recognizable to him, but perhaps not to be fully trusted. And then just to point a little bit towards where some of my research is going, what's interesting to me is that there's a shift I've noticed after the Revolution. Once Quakers withdraw from politics, beginning with the 7 Years' War, but then especially during the Revolution, there's a new fascination and attention paid to Quaker women and their bonnets. So Quaker identity in the 19th century seems to move onto the shoulders of women, and observers start paying increasingly close attention to Quaker women's bonnets. And this is an avenue that I'm just doing a lot of research on now. So it's just a hint of where I'm going. Okay, then going back to the cartoon. Then there were the Germans, like the blindfolded man in the Paxton print. German-speaking immigrants were the largest segment of non-British European arrivals to North America in the 18th century, most of them disembarking in Philadelphia. They were a diverse group drawn from a variety of places and religious backgrounds in Europe, and they represented varied class and occupational backgrounds. Because they were newcomers and non-English, however, they also attracted a lot of attention. Some people hailed them as a kind of model minority for their thriftiness and hard work. Others saw them as curiosities. Still others criticized them. In an off-cited quote from Benjamin Franklin that I'm sure you've heard, he called them Palatine boors and likened them to swine who swarm into our settlements and become a colony of aliens. At first glance here, the German man might not be readily recognizable as German to our modern eyes, but he does wear that prop, the blindfold. That blindfold was most definitely a visual commentary on German status within the colony. Both Paxton critics and Paxton apologists agreed that the Germans were dupes being led along by others during this crisis. One Paxton critic charged that the Scots-Irish had tried to, quote, blind the Dutch or Germans by all the political dust they can raise. Paxton apologists agreed, arguing that the blindfolded German was nothing more than a powerless and foolish dupe who was being led along by Benjamin Franklin and the Quakers. Yet, if we look closer at this particular depiction, there are some subtle cues of German distinctiveness, including the blunt cut of the man's hair, the styling of his coat, the ties at the bottom of his breeches, and what looks to be his laced rather than buckled shoes. These were material distinctions that would have been recognizable to people of the time, because Germans often did dress differently than their English counterparts. This is especially true of German sect people, such as the Moravians and Dunkers, or Anabaptists like the River Brethren, whose ascetic styles were reminiscent of the Quakers. But it was also true of more mainstream Lutheran and Reformed Germans who formed the bulk of German settlers. They also wore recognizably German styles of dress that were plainer and more colorful than English styles. This pair of men's breeches is quite typical. Although they're made of English Manchester velvet, what today we pretty much call corduroy, their plain styling, their simple construction, and the blue and white tape ties at the waist are prototypically Pennsylvania German. They also appear quite similar to the breeches worn by the man on the right of this late 18th century frocktour cutwork from Lancaster County. Text-based sources offer additional confirmation. When servants Bastian Panner and his wife Katrina ran from their Berks County master in 1766, he wore, quote, a long German jacket and waistcoat. Her clothes were, quote, altogether German except the cap, and consist of a black striped petticoat, white handkerchief, and speckled stockings. And I haven't been able to find a good picture of a woman in speckled stockings, but this frocktour cutwork gives you a sense of speckled stockings that men wore. And I've noticed those in a number of the illustrations I have of men wearing speckled stockings. So clearly that was something that people of both genders wore. In passing by one of Pennsylvania's many Lutheran churches in the 1790s, another European traveler noted that it seemed as if he was witnessing, quote, a church in Westphalia. So much have all of these farmers kept their ancestors' costume. Only the most young farmers have given up the straw hat for the cap of black silk. But for the men, the green coats, light blue ones, and large pulled down hats, boots extending above the knee, as in Germany, seemed the norm. German colonists themselves also acknowledged these sartorial distinctions. Henry Muhlenberg wrote that Pennsylvanians were, quote, astonished when they see German dress. And according to the historian Cynthia Falk, color was an especially significant indicator of German ethnicity. Blue and green coats, like the deep blue German jacket, a little mixed with white, that one runaway servant wore in 1771, were quite typical. The German-American illustrator Lewis Miller confirmed such depictions in his 19th century sketchbook. In the notes that accompany this particular sketch, for example, he readily acknowledged that this rural German couple dressed differently than others. He described them, quote, as odd and strange people who were, quote, curious in their dress. Then there's his drawing of John Hay, who had been the president of York's Lutheran Church. Though Miller depicted him as more Anglo or American in his fashion, the cut of his coat and his short, straight haircut suggest a simpler, more German style. Okay, so then the last group I want to talk about are the Scots-Irish. So lastly, there is the Scots-Irishmen. The Scots-Irish, or the Irish as they were most often called during the 18th century, were Pennsylvania's other major non-English immigrant group. Nearly 100,000 of these Ulster immigrants, most of them Protestants, most of them Presbyterians, came to the colonies between about 1718 and 1775. And Pennsylvania was their primary destination. Unlike the Germans, with their distinctive cultural traditions, Protestant Irish culture was more elusive. They were a migratory people, after all. Some of them had only recently arrived in Ulster before coming to America, and certainly so much movement had demanded a certain cultural flexibility. They were also a people that had been imperialized and colonized by the British. So most of them spoke English, and they very much understood Anglo politics and law. Scholars agree that their attachment to Presbyterianism was probably central to their identity, was probably the central feature of their identity. But even that, as one historian notes, was quite fractured. Also significant, Presbyterian religious identity was not physically visible. I mean, they didn't dress in any particular way to express their beliefs. Probably the easiest way to recognize them in the 18th century was by their distinctive brogue, by their speech. But Irish appearances did count. Benjamin Franklin made that clear in his 1764 critique of the Paxton Boys, when he described them as having freckled faces and red hair, suggesting a kind of distinctive Irish bodily appearance. And the British had long recognized distinctive forms of Irish dress. Gaelic Irish men were known for their long, thick, curly hairstyles, and you sort of get a sense of that here. They were known as well for the long, heavy mantles, which you see depicted in many of these drawings, that they wore as capes and sometimes as hoods. And they were known for the woolen stockings they wore as leggings. And both Irish men and women were known for the distinctive flat-soled shoes that they wore, which were known as brogues, later on as brogans, that typically had two fastening straps tied with laces. And you see a kind of medieval version of one in the top right of the slide. To the English, these styles were offensive and potentially subversive. Long hair obscured faces, Irish mantles concealed bodies. Some English imagined the Irish were naked under their mantles, which was a sign they thought of sexual promiscuity. Or they feared that they were hiding weapons under these mantles, a sign of their inherently violent temperaments. The upshot, as historians have detailed, was that the English tried to use sumptuary laws to drum Irish dress out of existence, but they did so with only mixed success at best. Instead, really, it was rising consumer demand and access to markets outside of Ireland, beginning during the early modern period and continuing very much into the 18th century, that redressed the Irish in ways that were much more like the English or people on the European continent. So by the 18th century then, it was not so much about what clothes the Irish wore that was in dispute, but how they wore them or what they didn't wear that mattered to observers. And as an example, we can look to another British cartoon. This is English cartoonist James Gilray's 1779 print, Paddy on Horseback. Gilray's cartoon uses absence and presence of material goods to critique this Irishman. It shows, as you can see, a poorly clothed Irishman, a Paddy, who is dressed in a rather unfashionable short jacket, which would be a working man's jacket, and patched knee breeches. You can see the patch right there. His hair is disheveled. He's wearing no stockings, shoes, or wig, and he's riding backwards on a bull who is galloping wildly towards London. He sits on a sack of potatoes and whips the bull with his felt hat while using the animal's tail as his rein. This is drawn clearly to confirm many contemporary English stereotypes of Irishmen. Gilray's Irishman is unkempt, which by implication signals his poverty and lack of civility. I mean, he wears unfashionable clothing. His clothing is worn out. He lacks shoes and stockings. And in riding backwards, the Paddy's shown as being kind of stupid or bungling. You know, he doesn't know how to ride a horse or ride an oxen. He doesn't know what he's doing. So he's kind of stupid. But what's interesting here is that there's also more at work, because there are actually signs that he has some civilization. He has a book in his saddlebag, and if you could see that close up, you could see that it's a volume entitled New Systems of Fortune Hunting, which suggests that he's literate. And he's cunning and devious too, because he's armed with a list right there of English women's names with their fortunes listed. So this Paddy is a fortune hunter who aims to marry one of them and alter his circumstances. So the cartoon then kind of raises some questions about, well, are the Irish really as stupid as we think of them after all? And I think it also raises some questions about who's in control here. So let me go back to the Paxton print. In the Paxton print, the clues about the Irishman are a bit trickier to decipher. As this detail shows, he's dressed in typical English style. He wears a coat, not the short jacket of Gilray's print. He wears knee breeches, and his knee breeches do not appear to be ripped or patched or out of style. He doesn't wear a wig, but his hair is very much under control. And he has on what we would call a cocked or tricorn hat, which was a style of the day. More important, given the Gilray cartoon, he wears both stockings and shoes, which might actually be brogues. They might be tie shoes. So unlike that English cartoon, this Irishman is fully and even reasonably fashionably clothed. And I'd argue these are very probably visual clues about the Protestant Irishman's ability to assimilate into colonial American culture and to gain real authority in Pennsylvania, which were two of the key issues being debated during the Paxton crisis. So then what does the artist use to distinguish him? Well, it's the rifle. The Hibernian, like the native man, carries a weapon, a material symbol of violence. And that's important for a couple of reasons, I'd argue. In the context of the Paxton crisis, it's a way to call out frontier Scots-Irishmen as the Paxton men, who so brutally murdered the Conestoga Indians in Lancaster. Similarly, the murdered figures in the foreground and the cabin in the background, back there, illustrate the devastating outcomes of violence waged between frontiersmen and Indians armed with guns and hatchets. The Irishman here may dress English in style, but his clutch on that weapon suggests an inherently violent and disorderly temperament that threatens the public peace and political order of the colony. This Irishman has power, and that power or potential power was what was in dispute at this time in Pennsylvania. Interestingly enough, again pointing forward, such portrayals of powerful Irishmen did not actually hold for long. By the early 19th century, following the lead again of British cartoonists like Gilray and many others, Americans shifted to portraying the Irish as fools and drunks who had few cares or who were too inebriated to notice them. This page from the New Irish Jest and Song Book, which was published in Baltimore in 1803, offers an example of what I'm talking about. Here, the Irishman may be carrying a weapon, this time the cudgel, but he appears to be more ready to dance than fight, which the song below the illustration, which I'll read to you, confirms. So as the song lyrics state, quote, "The courage and generosity in this Irishman's heart were fueled only by the, quote, fumes of whiskey in his head, which enabled him to, quote, forget care and fear no colors. The Irishman's, quote, native glory then was as a drunken fool carrying a stick. He had become a kind of clown, a caricature, rather than a villain by the 19th century." So then, let me conclude by offering a few thoughts. First, and perhaps I think most obviously, my work reveals the essential role that personal observation played in the process of sorting out the diverse people who inhabited colonial Pennsylvania and the Atlantic world more broadly. Whether in America or in Europe, people were keenly aware of those around them who were culturally different than themselves. And this is especially true of people who they perceived of as strangers or outsiders. They looked for visible physical or material clues to explain those differences, and they drew upon metropolitan aesthetic standards to assess these individuals or groups in ways that promised to reveal their essential characters or qualities and sort of reveal the essence of these newcomers. That said, it's also critically important to remember how much this process of visually assessing others remained a negotiated one with uncertain outcomes. The process was part of a broader transatlantic dialogue, as I've tried to suggest today by using these illustrations, about nationalities, races, and their character traits that empires such as the British and nations such as the US, especially post-1776, were using to sort and winnow people who they either hoped to rule abroad or immigrants that they hoped to keep in check at home. But this dialogue was very much in flux because the metropolitan gaze it relied upon was ultimately not all-consuming. Visual satirists on both sides of the Atlantic gained audiences precisely because cultural power in Britain and America remained up for grabs. In mocking the Quakers, the Germans, or the Irish, these writers and artists actually demonstrated the social and political influence these groups had or the threats that they posed to power brokers in Britain and America. In some, as the historian Ned Landsman has observed, there was a real contest for authority in the mid-Atlantic, but that contest, as he says, was, quote, less over who would actually rule at home than who would get to define whose home it was to be. Then I would be remiss if I didn't note that in the American context especially, notions of ethnic difference were being always refracted against the racial differences posed by Native Americans and Africans. And I've only talked about that a bit here. I've just hinted a little bit at it, but it is important to keep in mind. In this way, ethno-religious identities were constructed in response to both European-derived aesthetic norms and in contrast to what a lot of Europeans saw as the negative examples offered by non-white peoples in the Americas. And then finally, I think 18th century politics of dress has a lot to say about our society today and how we continue to struggle to negotiate the plural and multicultural society we're a part of. As you know, discussions over hijab-wearing Muslim immigrants reveal, singling out people and ridiculing them for their religiously inspired dress is still with us today. And I'm reminded of how we continue to use material clues to distinguish newcomers from natives and to kind of make decisions, policy decisions, including about who should be a part of the US and who shouldn't. And this is despite today's global consumer culture. So I would argue then, as kind of the last word, that this still has, looking at these kinds of trends in the 18th century, still has lots and lots of relevance for today. So thank you very much. And I will stop sharing my PowerPoint, and I'd be happy to chat with you if you have questions. Yep, I think it's
Thanks so much for such a fascinating presentation and really great visuals to go along with it. So we have a couple of great questions. The first one is, wouldn't the Scots-Irishman's musket identify him as someone on the frontier, or that weapon would have been a necessity of daily life for both hunting and homestead defense that wouldn't have been as relevant to a Philadelphian?
Oh yeah, I think absolutely. Yeah, I haven't mentioned that, but absolutely that would absolutely have identified him as a frontiersman. And there are some disputes. Historians kind of debate how prevalent guns actually were, but certainly that was, much as the tomahawk was a way to stereotype the Native American man, the rifle was most definitely a way to stereotype not just all Scots-Irishmen, but frontier Scots-Irishmen. So absolutely. Good point.
Our next question is, has your research revealed anything about Mennonite clothing or visual cues in 18th century Pennsylvania?
No, I haven't really done a lot of work on the Mennonites yet. And I'm not sure that I will. I've been sort of the research I've done thus far, I've done most work on the Scots-Irish and the Quakers. I've done the least amount of work on the Germans. So I've started mostly with German Lutheran and Reformed peoples, and I'm kind of debating about how much I want to talk about the various German sect peoples, mostly because they are a little bit more complicated and a little bit more consciously out of the mainstream. And so I am still debating about whether or not I really want to engage with them. I'm happy to hear thoughts. People have strong thoughts one way or the other, but that's definitely a part of my project that I'm still working on researching for sure.
Are there any challenges with finding images or material culture from other groups?
Yeah, so actually there are a lot of challenges in finding extant clothing from people in the 18th century. Generally, most of the extant clothing in the 18th century tends to skew towards much higher class people. And so it is, and very Anglo or continental inspired styles. So it is one of the reasons why I've ended up turning to a lot of cartoons and prints, is that they depict things that are very difficult to find in museum collections. Now there's lots and lots. One of the reasons why I've ended up working a lot with the Quakers is that there's a lot of extant Quaker clothing. And I think that's also fascinating too. I mean, clearly as a group, they have done through, over well more than a century, there has been really a concerted effort within families to save a lot of their clothing. There's clearly a sensibility there that they have, that their clothing is important and that it needed to be retained. And I think that's because they were people who kind of moved out of the mainstream when we get kind of certainly into the 19th century, but even by the late 18th century. So really one of the big challenges of this project has been finding extant pieces of clothing and then being able to identify it, because some of you who know much about 18th century clothing, particularly the clothing of more ordinary people, is that plain kinds of clothing were actually worn by a number of groups. So I could have brought in some photos of some gowns that I've seen at Winneter and at the Chester County Historical Society. And as the curator at Winneter said to me, it's kind of unclear. This could be either a Quaker dress or perhaps a Pennsylvania German dress. because they wore similar sorts of plain styles, simple style, and again, we're talking about people more what we would consider to be working class people, ordinary people. And these would be their everyday dresses or gowns that they wore. And so it's sometimes hard too for me to decipher precisely what group extant materials go with. So again, I'm trying to use a whole variety of source materials to make to draw some meaningful conclusions about what likely existed in the 18th century, what were the kinds of things people were wearing, and what things actually look like. But I will tell you, it's a complicated process. And before this project, I really didn't know a lot about 18th century clothing. I had a basic understanding of 18th century clothing, but I'm not a seamstress. I don't sew. So I've learned a lot of things about how things are constructed, about types of fabric, and also about styles that kind of that often cut along ethnic or religious lines. So I've learned a lot from the project.
We have another question, but before we get to that, can you talk a little bit about what you found at Lancaster History?
Okay, so at Lancaster History, I looked at I tried to bring in a few slides of some things that I looked at. I looked at the River Brethren dress and shawl, which is very, very similar to some things that I've seen at Winter that were, again, either Quaker or Pennsylvania German. So it's very much in keeping with what I've seen. The other thing I did is I looked at a couple of different other source materials. I looked at a lot of Lancaster newspapers, and I couldn't really work it in today in my talk, but one of the things that I've found too is I have some photos of extant hats, like I found one at Colonial Williamsburg, I found one at Winter, that were made in Lancaster. So I found some great newspaper advertisements of hat makers in Lancaster, including an advertisement for a bonnet maker, which works nicely with some of the work that I'm doing on Quaker bonnets in the early 19th century. And I also looked at a bunch of account books because I was able to sort of see how one of the things I'm trying to do a little bit more with are shoes. And so I looked at a couple of account books that were kind of showing the purchase of shoes and the purchase of clothing to try to get a sense of what's kind of going through local stores. And I just couldn't find some good examples to kind of bring in today in my PowerPoint. So that's mostly what I did when I was there.
Great. All right, we have another question. Were you able to identify clothing differences among ethnic women? What is the sort of gender dimension of the research?
Yeah, so the gender dimension is, I think, more important than I initially thought it would be. So certainly, as I'm trying to suggest a bit, plain clothing, women also wore plain clothing. And Quaker women, German women in particular, are often wearing similar styles of dress or gown. What's interesting too is the way women's hats, like the rise of the Quaker bonnet, is kind of interesting because that becomes, as I said, a kind of hallmark of the Quakers by the 19th century. And I think that what I'm seeing, and I have some information too about Scots-Irish women as well, I think that what I am seeing is something that's rather typical of a lot of immigrant groups in the US, is that initially, when immigrant groups arrive, men and women often tend to wear fairly traditional garb. I mean, that's kind of a general pattern. But as in the 19th century, women often become the people who kind of continue these ethnic traditions. And I think I'm seeing a lot of that kind of pattern in the 18th and early 19th centuries, that women become the people who sort of hold the tradition, hold the kind of old world culture. And part of the way they're doing it is in terms of their personal appearance. And so, so it's also interesting to me, again, one of the things that's been most striking about this research is the incredible number of Quaker bonnets that are in museum collections. German Historical Association in Germantown has boxes and boxes of Quaker bonnets. Chester County Historical Society has boxes of Quaker bonnets. So again, there is something too about, it is so interesting to me the way so many women's items of clothing were saved. Men were not. I have yet to find an extant example of a Quaker man's broad-brimmed hat from the 18th century. And I think that's fascinating. So there is a gender dynamic here. I haven't quite worked out exactly how it plays out over time. But what I can say is that clearly women come to hold a certain amount of this ethnic identity, and they are seen as sort of the preservers of this ethnic identity. And their ancestors hold on to their goods clearly because they associate women with this very vital kind of family and community function, which I found to be quite interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. All right, so we'll do one more question before we let you go. So one question is, I think about thinking of other working women like British and French as new immigrants. How would they be identifiable, or would they be identifiable?
Yeah, that's like the $1 million question. To a large extent, all working class people of the 18th century are wearing, there are some similarities in the way they are dressed. They are wearing certain, generally more coarser fabrics, simpler styles. And so would you be able to necessarily pick, decipher precisely an English person from a Scots-Irish person? That's tough. Certainly, though, you could decipher like a working class English man from probably a Quaker man. And you could probably easily decipher a working class English man from a working class German man. So as you can see, I've tried to, the Irish are the group that's really sort of tied me in knots, even though I've done the most work on them over the course of my career, because in many respects, they dressed a lot like the English. And the styles that would have characterized them would be very, very subtle. So one of the things I'm sort of continuing to debate as I've been researching and writing some of this book is just, how do I deal with this? And I think what I'm ending up doing mostly with the Irish is talking a lot about how stereotypes actually exaggerated an appearance and exaggerated differences that in many respects were not there. They really weren't. And they do so because of all of the dynamics between the British and the Irish in particular during the early modern period. There is a kind of power struggle going on. And so it is worth the while of various observers like cartoonists, like politicians, to sort of try to denigrate and stereotype the Irish as much as possible to make them seem more different than they were. So some of what I'm ultimately dealing with in this study is how representations like cartoons of the Irish are actually creating distinctions that probably didn't exist in reality. So,
and I imagine there's some privilege that goes along with being able to dress like everyone else and not be visibly distinguished.
Right. And if you know much about Irish history, there's a big debate among Irish historians about when the Irish became white. And most people argue, oh, it's the mid-19th century, it's mid to late 19th century. And my work is sort of suggesting, no, I think it actually happened before that. And some of that has to do with, especially in early America, the fact that most Irish immigrants were Protestants. And so that made them culturally more acceptable than those Catholic Irish who come over in such large numbers in the 19th century. So, yeah.
Well, Well, there are some additional questions, but we're past time now. So I think I'll conclude this evening's event. If anybody has additional questions, I'm sure Dr. Ridner is happy to answer them. Yeah, her email is findable.
Yeah.
And feel free to reach out to either one of us if you have additional questions. So thank you everyone so much for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Ridner, for joining us. And yeah, everybody check out our upcoming April events, and definitely becoming a member is a great way to support us and a great way to get free or discounted tickets for all of those events. Thank you so much and have a lovely evening.